Maria, that was a beautiful talk. I really enjoyed it. Gracias. I'm Lida Simpson, and I've cut my speech in half. I'm sure you'll be glad to hear. I'm with the LGBTQI group of the DeKalb County Democratic Party, and I wanted to thank the Progressive Women's Action Coalition for inviting me to speak this evening and hosting this event. It's been wonderful. I have chosen to speak about two lesbian feminists of the second wave, and we've already talked about the second wave being the wave that started in about the 1970s, and you've already gotten all the history that I was going to share with you, so we're just going to say we all know about it now, right? I'm very proud of the two lesbian feminists I'm going to talk about because they were activists who really contributed an amazing role to the women's movement of that time. And not only that, both of these lifelong activists were born and raised in Alabama. So I think, that they are two women that we can really take a lot of pride in. They are part of the huge progressive history of this state that we sometimes forget. And maybe remembering this history tonight can help inspire all of us who continue in the struggle against the oppression that we're now facing in these dark times in America. First of all, I'd like to ask, how many self-identify as feminist in this room? And it's okay for guys to be feminist. All right, it's okay to raise your hand if you... Okay, wonderful. Anybody want to tell me what it means to you to be a feminist? Yeah, we got a microphone. You can stand up and say. What does it mean?
It means fighting for women's rights, and it means fighting for human rights, because women's rights are human rights.
Right. Excellent. Yeah. Anybody else want to add to that or anything?
Fighting patriarchy.
Okay. Fighting the patriarchy.
To me, it means realizing men and women are equally intellectual, and they can do the same things intellectually.
Right on. Okay. Anybody else? Yes.
For me, it's embracing being female, not believing the conditioning that being male is better.
Okay. Excellent. Anybody else want to add to that?
I think in a broader scope, as a guy who's also a feminist, is also recognizing that men were hurt by patriarchy too. The whole, you can't cry, you have to be tough, you have to be the breadwinner, you're a failure if you're not, is kind of the mirror image of what feminism is fighting from the female side of the coin.
Right. Okay. All excellent definitions. I would say it's someone who supports the empowerment of women and the empowerment of men to be human, and not have to live those requirements. So yes. Okay, well let's move on to the two lesbian feminists of the second wave I'm going to focus on tonight. They are Dr. Minnie Bruce Pratt and Dr. Mab Segrest. They're both called doctor because they both obtained PhDs in English literature. So you got to really watch out for those English lit people because they can get really dangerous. I use the word lesbian a lot in this talk because they were both very out and proud lesbians, and that was very important to them when they came out in the 70s, and a time when it was rather dangerous to be doing that, even more so than what we're facing now. They were both born in the late 1940s and grew up in the same southern white segregated culture of small town Alabama, yet they managed to grow beyond it. The culture of their families groomed them to be quiet, God-fearing Southern ladies of education and manners. And that's not exactly how they defined their lives. They evolved into self-identified, quote, lesbian feminist warrior poets, end quote, in solidarity with Audre Lorde, who was the first feminist to describe herself as a, quote, black lesbian mother warrior poet, end quote. And many have called the second wave of the feminist movement the revolution led by poets. So 2 of them were from Alabama. Now I'm going to skip a little. Okay. Minnie Bruce Pratt was born in 1947 and raised in her hometown of Centerville. And Centerville is a small town of about 2,800 people just south and a little east of Tuscaloosa. Mab Segrest was born in 1949 in Birmingham, Alabama, and grew up in Tuskegee. We're going to see a little bit why that's been up there all night, where her family on both sides lived for over a century. Mab and Minnie Bruce were born just 2 years apart and grew up about 2 hours away from one another in South Alabama. Yet they never met until they both became activists within the emerging feminist movement of the 70s. Minnie Bruce wrote that as a teenager in 1965, she watched in horror on television as violence erupted on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, not far from where she lived. Approximately 600 mostly black civil rights marchers were marching from Selma to Montgomery on their first march for voting rights. Footage of the bloody violence they were met with from state troopers who used their dogs, high-pressure water hoses, and batons to attack and beat the defenseless marchers that day sent a collective shock throughout the nation and galvanized the fight against racial injustice. Minnie Bruce wrote in her book Rebellion that watching this horror unfold on television was the beginning of a sea change in her life that led to her becoming a political activist. She recalled in an interview that her first act of resistance against her Southern upbringing happened when she voted for the first time at age 18 in Bibb County, Alabama. Her father was watching over her shoulder as she voted. When he saw that she was voting for a candidate identified with the image of a Black Panther on her ballot, he said to her, "You cannot do that." Minnie Bruce, at 18, turned around to her father and responded, "Yes, I can." And she so voted. From Mab Segrest's website, we learned that she also grew up into the crucible of the civil rights movement. Her childhood experience in Alabama's apartheid culture shaped her future work as an activist, writer, and scholar. As a young woman, she left Alabama for graduate school in North Carolina, carrying in her baggage family legacies that included the destruction of Reconstruction, the Ku Klux Klan, attendance at a segregated private school, and the murder by a distant Segrest relative of civil rights worker Sammy Young in her hometown. Segrest earned her PhD in literature from Duke University, but more importantly, in North Carolina and across the country, dynamic, multiracial, feminist, and lesbian movements gave her the context to unpack her bags and sort them through as writer, activist, teacher, and public intellectual. Minnie Bruce also left Alabama for North Carolina in her mid-20s to obtain her PhD in English literature from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. By this time, she was married with 2 young sons. In 1975, Minnie Bruce came out to herself, her family, and the world as a lesbian. Her only regret, she later wrote, was that she came out before her divorce was final, and before she had obtained at least shared custody rights of her 2 sons. During her divorce, her husband demanded full custody of their 2 sons because of Minnie Bruce's honesty with him about being lesbian. If Minnie Bruce fought for custody, he informed her he would charge her as an unfit mother under crime against nature laws, in effect in many states at that time, which basically were if you were homosexual, you could be charged as a felon. The crime against nature law in North Carolina would have made Minnie Bruce a convicted felon if her husband had followed through on that threat, and she could have lost even visitation rights with her sons. So she made the painful decision to surrender custody of her sons in exchange for guaranteed visitation rights, and she was able to maintain a relationship with them the rest of her life and her grandchildren. Minnie Bruce paid a high price for coming out as a lesbian. From that time forward, she vowed to live her life proudly as a totally out-of-the-closet lesbian. About 14 years after her divorce, Minnie Bruce wrote a book of poems to her sons, which she called Crime Against Nature. In 1989, Crime Against Nature won the Lamont Poetry Prize, a prestigious national award given by the Academy of American Poets. Minnie Bruce was the first openly lesbian feminist poet to receive mainstream recognition for a book of poems that included explicit lesbian content. I think that's a little bit of poetic justice there because her ex-husband was also a poet, and I don't think he ever won the Lamont Prize. And you know, I don't think he probably was as good of a poet after he treated Minnie Bruce the way he did. Okay, so Minnie Bruce went on to publish 8 books of poems in her lifetime, as well as 3 books of essays and creative nonfiction. Her writings were not only brilliant literary works, they were often fiercely political, condemning the racism, misogyny, homophobia, and greed within American culture. She was a sharp critic of these oppressions and a boots-on-the-ground activist in protesting against the injustices she wrote about in the world. She not only created theory intellectually, she put that theory into practice. And this is what is called praxis, when you combine your theory with the acts in your life. She was active in organizing first for women's issues, then gender issues, LGBTQ issues, anti-racist work, and anti-imperialist initiatives. Excuse me. Minnie Bruce's greatest power was the power of her love for the people she stood up for, and in her political activism, and the power of her words. As she wrote, quote, "I have struggled over how to use words to search out a connection between me and others, the way lightning from the ground meets lightning in the air, a fiery spirit that calls but does not command another." Minnie Bruce always was proud to tell others she was from Alabama. She returned to Centerville throughout her life, even though she lived most of her adult life on the East Coast, where she could find teaching positions in women's studies, and where she and her second marriage partner, the trans woman Leslie Feinberg, author of Stone Butch Blues, could live more safely in the anonymity of larger, more liberal towns on the East Coast. Minnie Bruce was married for 22 years to Leslie Feinberg until Leslie's death in 2014. Excuse me. Minnie Bruce died of a brain tumor in 2023 at the age of 76. So, unfortunately, our paths never crossed. I would love to have met her, but But let's go back to that pivotal year of 1975. The year Minnie Bruce came out and suffered so much personal grief was also the year she met Mab Segrest. In 1975, they were both in Atlanta, and Minnie Bruce gave Mab a ride home to Tuskegee. Mab invited Minnie Bruce to join her as part of the women's collective that was publishing Feminary, a literary journal for lesbians in the South that did not shy away from tackling the cultural issues of racism, segregation, and misogyny. Minnie Bruce accepted Mab's invitation to work together on Feminary and moved to Durham. And then they worked on Feminary for the next 6 years. Feminary, based in Durham, was one of the early feminist journals in a massive national movement that came to be known as the Women in Print movement that erupted across America in the 60s and 70s. One of our speakers tonight referenced the amount of literature that happened during this time. The self-publication of lesbian feminist journals and books of prose and poetry was born of necessity, as mainstream publishers and even local printers often would refuse to print women's writings, sometimes labeling them obscene. To counter this attempted repression, women bought or leased presses, learned how to operate them, and printed their own works. These women did not have the internet to utilize for self-publication or for promoting their published works. Instead, they had determination and a national network of personal connections formed through the women's movement. They created their own book publishing companies and distribution networks by opening women's bookstores across America. Through their collective writing, publishing, and distribution work, they greatly expanded the availability of lesbian feminist literature to the wider world. This literature often was political, with a focus on how to resist the patriarchy, and I'm still reading it today. I've got several of their books up here if after this evening, or if you want to look at those after the talk. Gradually, many of those independent presses did not survive, and bookstores did not make it. They were bought out by chains or larger presses that took over. But some have survived, even today. And we also, in this region, still have Karis Books and More out of Decatur, Georgia, which is a feminist bookstore. And it was Minnie Bruce's favorite women's bookstore, where she often read her poetry for over 40 years. You can still buy her books there, and please support your local or regional feminist bookstore. As Minnie Bruce wrote, quote, "Resistance writing has been and always will be part of liberation movements," end quote. She also said, quote, "My words and my actions have entered the current of struggle. They are alive in people. That's all I want." And some final words of inspiration from Minnie Bruce, quote, "We are living through a terrible period when the voices of the unashamed racists, woman haters, and queer bashers of my segregated childhood are broadcast from the highest public offices in the land. We are living in a time when, as William Faulkner of Oxford, Mississippi once said, 'The past is never dead, it's not even past.' And yet, we are also living in the now, the only place where the future can be created. In this now, how will we bind ourselves to each other in solidarity? How will we strengthen each other towards renewed resistance to create a future where justice and mercy triumph?" Amen. Finally, tonight I want to share more about who Mab Segrest is with you, because I'm hoping that we might get her here sometime this summer as a speaker, and it would be fun. She is the author of 4 books of nonfiction, including her most well-known book, Memoir of a Race Traitor. And my favorite book of hers is Born to Belonging, Writings on Spirit and Justice. Her most recently published book is Administrations of Lunacy, about the history of it's not about the Trump administration. It could be. But it's about the history of the Milledgeville, Georgia Psychiatric Asylum. In her work as an activist, Mab chose to focus on fighting racism, primarily in North Carolina. In 1984, she joined several other activists in forming the nonprofit North Carolinians Against Racist and Religious Violence, NCARV. For 6 years, NCARV fought the Ku Klux Klan and several other white supremacist hate groups in North Carolina with some success. As an activist, Mab learned how to call a press conference, build a computer database, interact with community agencies, organize white and black people in small towns and cities, and monitor and call to accountability the criminal justice system. In NCARV, Mab worked closely with North Carolina black civil rights leader, the Reverend Wilson Lee. She admired Reverend Lee and his wife Alice for their bravery in the face of the white supremacist hatred directed against them. In Memoir of a Race Traitor, Mab tells a very good story about Alice Lee that I would like to read right now. It's short. Okay. Alice Lee was as brave as her husband. She told me once about a series of threatening calls to their home. She would answer the phone only to hear a white male's voice. The first time he called with a string of obscene insults, she said, "That's your mama." The second time he called to harass her, she said, "That's your grandmama." The third time, she said, "That's your great-grandmama." The fourth time, she said, "I can't go back any farther than that or we will be related." He hung up and did not call again. As feminist warriors and poets, Minnie, Bruce, and Mab actively engaged in what we now call the intersectional struggle against sexism, racism, classism, and homophobia that we continue to battle today. Waves build upon waves in the resistance to oppressive political forces within a country. Someone else talked about these waves earlier tonight. These waves do not disappear. They recede into a vast ocean full of undercurrents, where the pull of the tides of change eventually give rise to a new surging wave of resistance activists, headed once again towards shore. I do believe we are now riding the third wave of the women's movement onto the shores of America. This third wave began forming with the Women's March on Washington in 2016, right after Trump was elected the first time. And it gained momentum with the Me Too movement. We have yet to see what the full impact of feminist protest and political organization will be this time around. But I do believe that this third wave of feminists will do us proud. To end my talk, I would like to share a brief video of Mab Segrest speaking recently from her family graveyard in Tuskegee, Alabama, which explains why we have that up there. So.